Hello students and welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Shefali Nagpal, Associate Professor at Human Resource Development Center, Bhagat Phool Singh Mahila Vishwavidyalaya, Sonipat. We are studying the paper Development of the Management Thoughts, Principles and Types under Human Resource Management. Today we will discuss a very important and a very interesting topic, communication. After completing this module, you would be able to learn and to know the concept of communication, understanding the process and analyzing the importance of communication. Communication is a process. If the process breaks down, communication will fail. In this module, we will learn about the communication process. We will also discuss how the concept of noise can disrupt this process and the process of conveying information between two or more than two people. The process is the steps that we take to achieve a successful communication. The concept of communication, the communication process is the steps that we take to achieve a successful communication. The concept of communication. Let us understand the concept with the various definitions. Communication might be defined as the transfer of facts, information, ideas, suggestions, orders, requests, grievances, etc. from one person to another to impart a complete understanding of the subject matter of communication to the recipient thereof. The desired response from the recipient to such communication. Communication, as defined by the Knowles or Donnell, is communication is a way that one organization member share our meaning of understanding with another. Communication is a process of passing the information and understanding from one person to another as defined by the Davis. Communication is the sum of the things one person does when he wants to create understanding in the mind of another. It is a bridge of meaning. It involves a systematic and continuous process of telling, listening and understanding as defined by the Lewis A. Allen. Now let us discuss the few features of communication. By the above definition and the surrounding information that we gather, the following salient features of the concept of communication are: communication is necessary and required in all managerial functions. However, it is the integral part of the directing process and assumes greater significance in the directing stage. Communication is a function of every manager, hence it is pervasive managerial function. All managers would have to make necessary communication to their subordinates and give feedback to the communication from the latter. It is a continuous process throughout the organizational life. It is the basis of the organizational functioning. No communication, no functioning of the organization. Thus goes an old managerial adage. Communication is complete and rational process. Only when the recipient of the message has an understanding of the subject matter of communication, in fact, a transmission of understanding from the sender to the recipient of the message, something which is an important requirement from the human relation perspective of communication. Fifth, usually it is ought to be a two-way process. This emphasizes on the feedback aspect of the communication. The center of the communication, but communication usually is and ought to be a two-way process. This emphasizes the feedback aspect of communication, that is, the sender of the message must get the necessary response or reaction of the recipient to the communication made to him or her. Sixth, communication is always done with a purpose, that is, with the objective of evoking the desired response out of the recipient to the communication made. For example, if communication is work order by the superior to some subordinate, the latter must comply with the orders, undertaking the necessary actions for the implementation of the order. Seventh, it is a process that requires at least two parties, a sender of the message and the recipient of it. Naturally, one person would not make any communication to the self. Eighth, communication is a circular process. Its processes starts with the sender of the message traveling through the various stages completes with the feedback to the communication from the recipient to the sender. Principles of communication. To be effective and meaningful, the managerial functions of communication must be guided by the following principles. First is the principle of understanding. Communication must be such as transmits an understanding of communication message to the recipient as per the intentions of the sender. A practical application of this principle requires that the message must be expressed whether made orally or in writing. Further, the message must be complete, leaving no scope for any doubts likely to confuse the recipient and compel him towards a misinterpretation of the message. Second principle is the principle of attention. It must be made in such a manner that it invites the attention of the recipient to it. For a practical application of this principle, it is imperative that not only must the message be expressed pleasantly and soundly, but the purpose of the sender in making the communication must be clarified. Third is a principle of brevity. The message to be communicated must be brief, as usually the recipient, especially an executive, would not have much time to devote to single piece of communication. However, the brevity of the message must not be sought at the cost of clarity or completeness of the message. The sender must strike a balance between these two factors, brevity, clarity, and completeness. Fourth principle is the principle of timeliness. Communication must be in time, that is, it must be made at the high time when needed to be communicated to the recipient. An advanced communication carries with it the danger of forgetting on the part of recipient, while a delayed communication loses its purpose and charm and becomes meaningless when the right time for the action has expired. The principle of appropriateness or rationality is the next principle. In context of realization of the organizational objectives, it is must that the message must be appropriate and rational. Communication must be neither impractical on act upon nor irrational not to contribute to common objectives. The principle of feedback. Communication is a two-way process. The feedback, response, or the reaction, which we call, of the recipient of the message must be easily transferable from this receiver to the sender as the original communication made by the sender. The idea behind emphasizing on the feedback aspect of communication is that it helps the sender to modify his subsequent communications given the reaction of the recipient making for better and improved human relations. The principle of constructive and strategic use of informal groups. The management must not hesitate in making a valuable and strategic use of informal groups for ensuring and facilitating speedier communication in emergency situation. Such a use of formal groups would also help develop a good human relations by upgrading the status of informal groups and their leaders. However, management must assure itself that rumors are not spread by the informal groups, and for this, a guard over manner of functioning of informal groups while transmitting a formal communication is but imperative. Communication process. The communication process consists of the several components. Let's take a look. Sender. Sender is a party that sends a message. Let us understand with the help of example. Say Mridul is a sender. He will also need the message, which is the information to be conveyed. Mridul will also need to encode his message, which is transforming his thoughts into the information to be conveyed into a form that can be sent, for example, words, text, etc. A channel of communication must be selected in a proper way, which is the manner in which the message is sent. Channel of communication include speaking, writing, video transmission, audio transmission, electric transmission, through mails, emails, text messages, faxes, and even non-verbal communication such as body language. Mridul also need to know the target of his communication. This party is called receiver. Say Dwij is the receiver here. The receiver must be able to decode the message, which means mentally processing the message into understanding. If he cannot decode, the message fails. For example, sending a message in the foreign language that is not understood by the receiver, that is Dwij here, probably will result in decoding failure. Sometime a receiver will get the sender feedback, which is a message sent by the receiver back to the sender. For example, a member of Dwij's team may provide feedback in the form of a question to clarify some information received in the Mridul's message. The goal of communication is to convey information and the understanding of that information from one person or group to another person or group. This communication process is divided into three basic components. That is, a sender transmits a message through second, that is channel, to the receiver, which is third. The sender first develops an idea which is composed into the message and then transmitted to the other party, who interprets the message and receives the meaning. Information theorists have added a somewhat more complicated language. Developing a message is known as encoding. Interpreting the message is referred to as decoding. The other important feature is the feedback cycle. When the two people interact, communication rarely is one way. Receives a message, she corresponds or responds to it by giving a reply. The feedback cycle is the same as the sender-receiver feedback noted in the figure. Otherwise, the sender cannot know whether the other parties properly interpreted the message or how they reacted to it. Feedback is especially significant in management because a supervisor has to know how subordinates respond to directives and plans. The manager also needs to know how work is progressing and how employees feel about the general work situation. The critical factor in measuring the effectiveness of the communication is common understanding. Understanding exists when all parties involved has an agreement as to not only the information but also the meaning of the information. Effective communication therefore occurs when the intended messages of the sender. The critical factor in measuring the effectiveness of the communication is common understanding. Understanding exists when all parties involved have an agreement as to not only the information but also the meaning of the information. Effective communication therefore occurs when the intended message of the sender and the interpreted message of the receiver are the same. Although this should be the goal in any communication, it is not always achieved. The most effective and efficient communication occur at the minimum cost regarding the resources expended. Time in particular is an important resource in the communication process. For example, it would be virtually impossible for an instructor to take time to communicate individually with each student in the class about every specific topic covered. Even if it were possible, it would be costly. That is why managers often leave voicemail messages and interact by email rather than visit their subordinates personally. Steps or elements of communication process. The communication process refers to the steps through which the communication takes place between the sender and the receiver. This process starts with the conceptualization of the idea or the message by the sender and ends with the feedback from the receiver. In detail, communication process consists of the 8 steps. First, developing the idea by the sender. In the first step, communicator develops or conceptualizes an idea to be sent. It is also known as planning stage, since in this stage the communication plans the subject matter of communication. Second is encoding. Encoding means converting or translation of the idea into the perceivable form that can be communicated to others. Third is developing the message. After encoding, the sender gets the message that can be transmitted to the receiver. The message can be in the oral, written, symbolic or non-verbal form. For example, when people talk, speech is the message. When people write, words and the sentences are the messages. When people cry, crying is also a message. Then fourth is selection of the medium. Medium is the channel or the means of transmitting the message to the receiver. Once the sender has encoded him into a message, the next step is to select a suitable medium for transmitting it to the receiver. The medium of communication can be speaking, writing, signals, gestures, etc. Fifth is transmission of message. In this step, sender transmits the message through a chosen medium. In communication cycle, the task of sender ends with the transmission of the message. Then receiving the message by the receiver. This stage simply involves the reception of the sender's message by the receiver. The message can be received in the form of hearing, seeing, feeling and so on. Seventh is decoding. Decoding is the receiver's interpretation of the sender's message. Here the receiver converts the message into the thoughts and try to analyze and understand it. Effective communication can only occur when both the sender and the receiver assign the same and the similar meaning to the message. Eighth is feedback. The final step of the communication process is feedback. It means the receiver's response to the sender message. It increases the effectiveness of the communication. It ensures that the receiver has correctly understood the message. Feedback is the essence of two-way communication. Types of communication. There are two types of communication broadly: formal communication and informal communication. Formal communication is that which takes place in an enterprise or an organization in the formal manner via the scalar chain or line of command. This type of communication has the following variations, that is downward communication, upward communication, sideward communication. Downward communication means moving downward in an organization from top management to middle and middle to lower management, traveling via various links in the scalar chain. Such communication is imperative for the organizational purposes. Mostly, it consists of the communicating plans, policies of the enterprise to the lower level managers, and in particular, issuing orders and instructions to the subordinates for initiating action according to these for execution of the assigned jobs. Second is upward communication. This type of formal communication is a feedback to downward communication. Upward communication proceeds upward in an organization from the lower level management to middle and upper level management, traveling via various links in the scalar chain. Upward communication usually takes the following forms, like reports by the subordinate to superior on work performance, grievances, problems or difficulties of the subordinate forwarded to the superior at appropriate levels, suggestion and ideas of the subordinate to upper management for kind consideration and appropriate implementation. Fourth, clarifications sought by the subordinates from superior as the orders and instruction issued by the latter. Third is sideward or horizontal communication. This type of formal communication takes place among the managers placed at the same rank in the organization. It is necessary for achieving coordination of the actions of the individuals doing the similar type of work under managers of equal ranks. For example, communication between the two assistant production managers is an instance of the horizontal communication. Sideward communication might take place through the gangplank, as suggested by the Fayol, or through the scalar chain hierarchically. Second is informal communication. Informal communication, also called grapevine communication, takes place through the informal groups existing inside and outside the organizational structures. This type of communication has no formal manner of routing. It might spread from one person to another and in any manner and any direction, like the structuring of the grapevine. Let us understand the communication theory. It was proposed by S.F. Scudder in the year 1980. It states that all living being exists on the planet communicate, although the way of communication is different. Plants communicate their needs to be taken care of and watered immediately through visible changes in the color of the leaves and the falling of the leaves and the flowers. Animals communicate by sound, several movements to indicate that they are hungry or unwell or need medical attention. A mother would never understand that her child is hungry until and unless the child cries. Crying is again a form through which the child communicates that he is hungry and needs food. The same applies when he is injured, where he uses crying again as a tool to communicate his pain and need of urgent medical attention. The universal law of communication theory says that all living beings, whether they are plant, animals, human beings, communicate through the sound, speech, visible changes, body movements, gestures, or in the best possible way to make the others aware of the thoughts, feeling, problems, happiness, or any other information. If the child scores fewer marks in the examination, parent would not speak to the child for some time. Again, an effort to communicate that parents are angry over the child performance and he needs to buck up for his further examination. Try to irritate a stray dog, he will surely bark on you. Again, an animal's way to communicate that he is angry and should not be irritated further. Like human beings, animals also communicate among themselves through the gestures and body movements. Monkeys always carry their babies with them wherever they go. Again, a way through which the mother tries to communicate that their babies are safe and the mother is there to take care of them. During the mating seasons of animal, communication through the gestures play an important significant role in bringing them close. The same way a peacock dances to attract the partner. Another model of communication says that communication is simply the process of transferring information from the sender to the recipient, where the recipient decodes the information and acts accordingly. The large number of the people also support this model of communication. Let us now understand the theoretical framework of communication theory. It includes mechanistic, psychological, social, systematic, critical considerations or the viewpoints. Let us discuss the mechanistic viewpoint. It states that communication is simply the transmission of the information from the first party to the second party. The first party is the sender and the second party is the receiver. Psychological. According to the psychological viewpoint, communication is simply not the flow of information from the sender to the receiver, but the thoughts, feelings of the senders which he tries to share with the recipient. It also includes the reactions, feelings of the receiver after he decodes the information. Social. The social viewpoint considers communication as a result of interaction between the sender and receiver. It simply says that communication is directly dependent on the content of speech. How one communicates is the basis of the social viewpoint. Systematic. The systematic viewpoint says that communication is a new and different message which is created when various individuals interpret it in their way and then reinterpret it and draw their conclusion. Critical. The critical viewpoint says that communication is simply a way with the help of which an individual expresses his power and authority among other individuals. The point to note about these theories is that they are representation of reality as seen by the proponents and also reflect the idealistic aspirations of these theorists. There is nothing to say that such structures alone exist. There is nothing to say that such structures alone exist or they are not valid. Instead, a nuanced view of organizational theory that has emerged in the recent years with the system of organization is something that is contemporary and relevant to agile and nimble organizations of the 21st century. Indeed, these theorists discussed here were pioneers during their time, and likewise the emerging crop of the management expert now are taking the view of these theorists to the next level. In the conclusion, all the management theorists acknowledge the natural progression of organizational model and hence their contribution to the field of organization control and communication are akin to each wave of theorists standing on the shoulders of giants who were there previously. Students, let us now summarize what we have studied in this module of communication. In this module, we studied that communication is a process of conveying information between the two or more people. It is a process where the steps are involved to achieve a successful communication, and if it is broken, communication will fail. We also learnt about the communication process and discuss the barriers and its various types, that is formal and informal communication and its variants. We also discussed the basis of communication theories framework in this module. That is all. Thank you.